There is a question that comes up repeatedly in difficult relationships. Can someone who rarely takes responsibility ever genuinely apologize? More specifically, can a person with strong narcissistic tendencies acknowledge that they caused harm and say it in a way that feels real? The short answer is complicated. Not because apologies are impossible, but because the conditions under which they occur are very different from what most people expect. In many cases, the mistake is not in what people are asking for, but in how they are trying to get it. The approach is often based on assumptions that do not align with how the other person processes responsibility, fault, and self-image. As a result, the more someone pushes for an apology in a conventional way, through explanation, emotional appeal, or repeated requests, the less likely it is to happen. To understand why, it is necessary to shift perspective. An apology, in its most basic form, requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It involves recognizing that one's behavior had a negative impact and accepting some degree of responsibility for it. For most people, this process is uncomfortable but manageable. It may involve temporary discomfort, but it does not fundamentally threaten their sense of self. For individuals with strong narcissistic tendencies, however, the situation is different. Responsibility is not processed in isolation. It is linked to identity. If their self-image is built around competence, control, or being right, then admitting fault can feel like a direct challenge to that identity. It is not just about what happened, it is about what the admission implies. A simple acknowledgement of harm can be interpreted internally as a broader statement about who they are. This creates resistance. Not necessarily because they are unwilling to apologize in principle, but because the psychological cost of doing so feels disproportionately high. The apology is not experienced as a small correction, but as a destabilizing act. This is why direct confrontation often fails. When someone says, "You hurt me, you need to apologize," the request is clear, but it places the other person in a position where the only way to respond is to accept fault explicitly. If that acceptance threatens their self-image, the likely response is deflection, minimization, or counter-accusation. The interaction becomes less about resolving the issue and more about protecting identity. In this dynamic, pushing harder rarely produces better results. It often intensifies resistance. The more pressure is applied, the more the individual feels cornered. And when someone feels cornered, they tend to defend rather than reflect. This leads to a cycle. One person seeks acknowledgement and repair. The other resists, reframes, or avoids. The lack of resolution increases frustration, which leads to more direct attempts to force accountability. In response, resistance increases further. Over time, the original issue becomes secondary to the pattern itself. Breaking this cycle requires a different approach, one that does not rely on forcing admission, but on changing the conditions under which acknowledgement becomes possible. This is where the idea of doing this begins to take shape. It is not a single action in the sense of a technique or tactic. It is a shift in how the situation is structured. The first element of this shift is removing the direct demand for apology as the primary objective. This may seem counterintuitive, especially when the goal is precisely that acknowledgement. But when the demand itself triggers resistance, continuing to center the interaction around it reinforces the very barrier that prevents it. Instead, the focus moves toward clarity and boundaries. Rather than insisting on an apology, the emphasis is placed on describing the impact of the behavior and establishing what is acceptable moving forward. This is done without escalation, without over-explanation, and without attempting to control the other person's response. The communication becomes informational rather than coercive. For example, instead of saying, "You need to admit what you did," the message becomes, "This behavior had this effect, and this is what I will do if it continues." The shift is subtle, but significant. It removes the immediate threat to identity while still maintaining accountability through consequence. This creates space. When the interaction is no longer framed as a forced admission, the individual is less likely to default into defensive patterns. The pressure decreases, and with it, the need for immediate self-protection. In some cases, this allows for a delayed form of acknowledgement to emerge, one that feels less like a forced concession and more like a voluntary adjustment. The second element is consistency. If boundaries are stated but not maintained, the message loses credibility. The individual learns that the consequences are not stable, and the incentive to reflect or adjust behavior decreases. Consistency, in this context, is not about rigidity, but about reliability. It signals that the information being communicated is meaningful and will be acted upon. Over time, consistent boundaries create a different kind of feedback loop. Instead of repeated confrontation followed by resistance, there is a pattern of action and consequence. The individual begins to associate certain behaviors with predictable outcomes. This does not guarantee change, but it alters the conditions under which behavior is evaluated. The third element is detachment from outcome. This is often the most difficult part. When someone has been hurt, the desire for acknowledgement is not just about resolution, it is about validation. It is about having the experience recognized as real and meaningful. Letting go of the expectation of an apology can feel like giving up on that validation. But there is an important distinction. Detachment from outcome does not mean accepting the behavior or dismissing its impact. It means recognizing that the other person's response is not fully controllable. It shifts the source of validation from external acknowledgement to internal clarity. When this shift occurs, the interaction changes. The request for an apology is no longer tied to emotional urgency. It becomes secondary to maintaining boundaries and observing behavior. This reduces pressure on the other person, but more importantly, it stabilizes the position of the person who was affected. Ironically, this is often the point at which an apology becomes more likely. Not because it was demanded more effectively, but because it is no longer being forced. The individual may begin to recognize the consistency of the response, the absence of escalation, and the clarity of the boundary. In that context, acknowledging fault becomes less threatening. It is no longer framed as a loss of identity, but as an adjustment within a stable interaction. However, it is important to be precise here. Even when an apology occurs, it may not take the form people expect. It may be indirect, partial, or delayed. It may focus on the outcome rather than the intention. It may lack the emotional tone typically associated with remorse. Interpreting this requires attention to pattern rather than form. Is there a shift in behavior? Is there increased consistency? Is there a reduction in the pattern that caused harm? These indicators are often more meaningful than the exact wording of the apology. Because ultimately, the function of an apology is not just to acknowledge the past, but to signal a change in the future. If the words are present but the pattern remains unchanged, the apology has limited value. If the words are imperfect but the behavior shifts, the underlying acknowledgement may be more substantive. This reframes the original question. The goal is not simply to obtain an apology. It is to create conditions in which accountability can occur, whether expressed verbally or behaviorally. And those conditions are not created through pressure, but through structure. Clear communication. Consistent boundaries. Reduced reactivity. Detachment from immediate outcome. these elements do not guarantee that an apology will happen. No approach can fully control another person's response. But they significantly increase the likelihood that, if acknowledgement is possible, it will emerge under these conditions rather than under pressure. At the same time, this approach has value independent of the outcome. Even if no apology is ever given, the individual who applies these principles is no longer dependent on that apology for clarity or stability. The focus shifts from trying to change the other person to managing one's own responses and decisions. And in many cases, that shift is more important than the apology itself. Because it restores a sense of control, not over the other person, but over how the situation is navigated. In the end, the idea that there is a single action that will make someone apologize is misleading. What exists instead is a set of conditions that either increase or decrease the likelihood of acknowledgement. When those conditions are misunderstood, the result is repeated frustration. When they are understood, the dynamic changes. Not always dramatically, and not always immediately, but in a way that is more aligned with how the interaction actually functions. And sometimes, within that shift, an apology does occur. Not because it was forced, but because, for the first time, it became possible.